Hello again. All right, so we were talking about you being a scholar of African slavery, especially Islamic slavery. Tell us about slavery in Islamic Africa.
Well, it's completely, uh, even among scholars, to a great extent, it's misunderstood, in my opinion. First of all, slavery was everywhere. Second, what the jihad movement, which was a Muslim reform movement, was not against slavery. What it was against was that it was against selling slaves to non-Muslims, particularly to Christians, because in Islam, uh, look, first of all, slavery is slavery. No one wants to be a slave. I'm telling you, no one wants to be a slave. So when I say that things are different, it doesn't mean that things are better or worse, because slavery is not a, it's a crime against humanity. It goes against, and it goes back a long way, and it's been in a lot of situations. Well, in the interior of West Africa, the jihad movement uh, didn't want to sell. You see, there's a big difference between slavery in Islam and slavery in the Caribbean and slavery in the Americas. A couple of big differences, very important differences. Uh, One, in the Caribbean, a, a baby is born and the baby inherits the status of the mother. The mother is a slave, the kid's a slave. Doesn't matter who the father is. In Islam, a person inherits the status of the father, not the mother. And if the father is free, the children are free, no matter what the status of the mother is. It's a big difference. It's a huge difference because it because many of the children that are born in slavery in Islamic countries are born uh, uh, from with a father who's free. So that means the children are free. They have to be treated the same way as all other children. Now, I'm not saying, of course, we know human beings. That doesn't mean it always happens, but that's what's supposed to happen. And in a general way, that's what did happen.
All
Okay?
right.
So that's one big difference, is that you inherit the status. The other big difference is that, listen, the problem with slavery in Islam is, how do you prove that someone is a slave? How do you know that? Whose responsibility is to testify? Who do you believe? In the Americas, you believe the white guy. You believe the master. The slave doesn't have any claim to legitimacy or to being able to testify or to be able to his and statement is not considered to be truthful. In Islam, no, just the opposite. Just the opposite. The proof is on the master. If the person is considered to be a slave, the master who has to prove that the person is a slave, not the individual. The master has to prove. How do you prove? Well, you can't enslave another Muslim. Now, it happened. A lot of Muslims were enslaved by other Muslims. But when they did, they said they were bad Muslims. Now, I'm not a religious person, so I'm not going to get into a debate over who's a good Muslim and who's a bad Muslim. I'll leave that to the Muslims to discuss. For me, if someone says they're a Muslim, I say, you know, I respect. Huh? Well, the only way you can really prove that it's very easy to prove that someone's a Muslim in historically in terms of slavery. Pray for me.
All
If
right.
you can't, if you can't pray, you ain't a Muslim. And the only acceptable prayer is the prayer that's in Arabic. The prayers that are said 5 times a day have to be said in Arabic. All right, you say you're a Muslim, pray. If you can't pray, you ain't no Muslim. If you pray and you have an accent and your Arabic isn't perfect, you're a bad Muslim. So, so there's a big difference in terms of proof and in terms of inheritance of status. And so that within Islam, and I'm not saying it always happens, but there's an ideology that the whole idea about slavery is that eventually everyone gets incorporated into the society as equal. Now there's been big fights and there's been a lot of written in Arabic about this not working the way it's supposed to. But nonetheless, the ideology says that, slavery disappears. A person's status, if you do your job as a slave and the master treats you well, then you should be able to get your freedom. You either do it because on deathbed the master grants you the freedom, or the master allows you to earn money so you can buy your freedom, or all these different types of things, which work a lot of the time and sometimes don't. Okay, sometimes don't. People are people, and people don't always do what they're supposed to do. But the attitude and the ideology is different in Islam than it is in the Americas. In the Americas, no matter what you do, you're still black. No matter what. So that's a different ideology. So that goes into racism, and it goes into a whole bunch of stuff, which ain't nice.
And how did they treat their slaves?
Hmm?
How did
Well, again, there's variation because a very large percentage of slaves ended up being domestic servants. And if you're having someone living in the house, of course, if it's a woman, she can be abused sexually and so on, and there's no recourse really. But in general, if you have servants living in your house, you treat them well because you want them to treat you well. You don't want someone poisoning you or anything like that. So that most domestic servants, of course, it's still slavery, and of course, we've evolved a lot socially so that, if you have somebody who cleans your house or somebody who does this, that, or the other thing, you treat them nice. And even the language changes because at a certain point in the past, people, if they worked as a servant, slave or free, if they worked as a servant, they had to address the person they're working for in a particular way. And there were particular types of manners that were imposed, and which dissipate. Now, if you hire a cleaning lady to come to clean your house today, you call him or her by their first name, and they call you by your first name, because because that's how we changed. A certain type of formality has disappeared because of changes in status, which is a good thing, not a
what about
problem.
manumission?
What, in Islam?
Yeah, manumission, yes.
Well, manumission is of two types because, first of all, if someone is captured and enslaved and they are a Muslim, which can be demonstrated they were a Muslim, then they really should not have been enslaved. And therefore, a situation is created where the state usually intervenes, and whoever supposedly owns the person who's not supposed to be a slave has to be paid a ransom, has to be paid some money. And usually this is done by the relatives of the person who comes and says, this guy is not a slave because this guy is my brother. And the family then had to come up with some cash to, in effect, ransom the guy. And so that's one thing that happened. Now, again, like all laws and things like this. Sometimes it didn't work, but usually it worked because if people discovered that their brother or their sister was in another town and was being held as a slave and they went there, they'd go to the court. They'd go to the judge. The judge would intervene. And now some judges are corrupt, but most aren't. And if there's no invested interest on the part of the judge is going to say, no, 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 this guy's a free person. You've got to pay a ransom price so that he can go home. So that's what they do. Then otherwise, a lot of people, I've written about this, a lot of people in the Muslim state that I study most, which is the Sokoto Caliphate, which is now Nigeria and neighboring countries, which is where it was because it was a very big state in the 19th century. If if I had a slave and the slave turned out to be loyal, trustworthy, did what he was supposed to do, and didn't try to run away and didn't do this, that, and the other thing, then what I do is during the long dry season when there's no farming, I let the guy, usually a guy, go live in his own place. He had to find a place that he could live, and he could work for himself. He could carry, he could carry goods for people. He could go into the countryside and cut grass to feed horses and cows, and he could do all those types of jobs. He could help to repair houses, and because of the rainy season, the houses get damaged, and he could earn money. And while he was earning money, he had to pay his master money in cash, which in Sokoto Caliphate was cowrie shells. And you had to pay so much per week or per month to your master to live on your own. But while you're living on your own, you could earn enough money over a number of years to buy your own freedom. And that was encouraged. So there are all kinds of ways. If a woman, she gave birth to a child by someone who's free, the woman cannot be sold. You think of yourself. You're a man. Your woman has a baby, and the baby's free. You want to separate the baby from the mother? No way.
No.
No way. So you just don't sell the mom, huh? And that was the law too. You don't sell the mother if she's given birth. She's protected. She's not free. She can't go or do anything she wants, but she cannot be sold. So these are important factors in looking at the system. But now the bad news is those jihad movements were violent confrontations of forcing people to come into the state, forcing people to do work, forcing people to do a lot of things, and there was a lot of slavery. Just not selling them to any Christian. A lot of slavery. The jihad state.
I was just about to ask you to tell us about the Sokoto Caliphate.
Yeah, well, the Sokoto Caliphate, which most people never heard of, was the
True.
largest state in Africa in the 19th century. It was the largest state in Africa since Songhai. It consisted of 33 emirates that stretched from what's now Burkina Faso across Niger and Nigeria, all the way across Cameroon. It was a big state. A lot of people. That state, we don't really have good population estimates, but we do have a good sense of how many plantations there were. A lot of plantations. The big industry in the Sokoto Caliphate was textile production. They grew their own cotton. They wove their own cloth. They dyed it, and they clothed half of West Africa, right? Well, a lot of that cotton was grown on plantations run by slaves. The Sokoto Caliphate, I estimate, had about all the jihad states together had more slaves in the 19th century than all of the Caribbean and Brazil and the United States combined at any point in history.
Wow.
Yeah, not pretty. A lot of consequences today in terms of political instability, all kinds of stuff like this. But all of West Africa, every one of the countries in West Africa today is part of the Muslim League because the majority of the population in every one of those countries is Muslim, not Christian. A lot of Christians, don't get me wrong, but the majority of the population in West Africa is Muslim. People just don't understand that. And we're not talking about some imported religion like Islam's been in West Africa for 1,000 years. How long does it have to be there before it's native? No, it's indigenous. Islam, Qadariya, Tijaniya, Ahmadiyya. All of these are brotherhoods that have a big following. People are very religious. Very, very religious.
Yeah, Asante Empire.
That's a consequence of the jihad ultimately, because when the Europeans take over, of course, the Muslims leadership has to cooperate with the invaders, of course, but it doesn't mean they stop being Muslim. It means they become more.
What about pawnship? Tell us about pawnship.
Well, there's none with Muslims. But with non-Muslims, it was a credit relationship. It was not slavery. In fact, its intention, its legality, was to protect people from being enslaved. Because technically, now it didn't happen all the time. It's like all laws and customs, there are violations and so on. But pawns were a form of security for a debt. If, like, my family and your family, like, we know each other well, and I'm the head of my family, and I suddenly have a financial crisis. I got 2 daughters that want to get married. I got a grandfather who dies. Well, I got funeral arrangements, I got marriage arrangements, I got all of this extra that I suddenly need some cash. So I go to you, my friend, my buddy, and I say, can you loan me some money? I'll pay you back and da-da-da. So it's not like I'm in debt or I'm poor or I'm hungry. It's because I need money for rituals, for whatever. And so that people, and so what do you do for security? Okay, I'll give you some money, but you can have some money from me, but while your daughter is going to come live with us until you pay me back. Yeah, that's pawn. That's the pawnship.
Interesting.
And it's usually girls. Not always. It can be anybody. But why girls? Because, all right, I'm daddy. You're a neighbor or a wealthy somebody that I know in the town who would do this. So my daughter, she goes and lives in your household. Well, the pawn is supposed to be treated like all the other children. Doesn't mean they always are. Usually they have a little more, cleaning duties and other things than some of the other children, But still, they're supposed to be fed at the same table. They're supposed to be, treated in the same fashion. And but anything they do is obviously belongs to the person that they're staying with. So if they help the woman of the house sell food on the street or things like that, they don't get any money from that. That goes to the family, doesn't go to her. And so why a girl? Well, here's a good strategy. What happens? I have to borrow this money, and I borrow it from you. Um, well, what happens if after the end of the time I'm supposed to pay you back, I can't? Well, maybe by then the girl has has fallen in love with somebody in the other household, uh, and then gets married. Then the debt's canceled because of the marriage. So send a girl first, because if there's just a possibility, because there's no sexual interaction, any sexual interaction, that girl will run home, and there'll be a war. Her daddy would be coming for you. No, no, no. So, and again, like all institutions and all situations, there are exceptions, and we have cases of them. But in fact, when we look at the information we have on people that were enslaved and sent to the Americas, very, very few people were pawned. It was an exception, not that somebody who was a pawn would end up as a slave. It was an exception. Now it's different, however, it's different if the person that loans the money is a Muslim, because Muslims don't recognize pawnship. If I loan you some money for the girl, she's mine, baby. I'm going to sell her. So pawnship only works between people who know each other, who live in the same place. And whenever it gets beyond that or out of control, then you have problems.
You have written
Okay?
on entrepreneurship in Africa. Who were the Wangara merchants?
The Wangarawa?
Yes.
Well, the Wangarawa is an interesting name. Wangara is a region of West Africa, which is now in sort of in Mali, in particularly southern Mali, and it's the area where um, uh, uh, there's gold was very important in the history of West Africa. The most of the gold was alluvial, that is taken from streams, but some of it was mined, and it was in a number of places. And that area where gold was produced was very important. It was a major source for gold in the Middle East and in Europe until the Americas were opened up by conquest. And that whole region is known as Wangara. And the merchants that are connected to that network, all Muslim, are usually called in West Africa Jula. And Jula it's a word that means merchant in the Mande languages. But these Muslim merchants, they travel all over West Africa, of course, because the one thing about Muslims and why they dominate trade is because they have a law, they have commercial law, because they have ways of dealing with commercial relationships over great distances. It's throughout the Muslim world, not just West Africa, and so Muslim merchants would go and establish satellite communities in other towns, just like the Lebanese do, like like a lot of people do, Chinese do, like a lot of people do. People from the homeland, they go but they have connections and they maintain, diaspora relationships, not slavery diaspora, but merchant diaspora. You have a brother who lives over there. You have an uncle who lives over there. You know people, and you don't just know them. There's interaction that often leads to intermarriage of quite a bit over distances, and as today. Uh, but that's the Wangara were those types of merchants. Does
Yes,
that
and
help?
yeah, of course it did, and they were quite successful. They were into manufacturers. I've read quite a bit on the Wangara merchants.
Yeah, and well, my initial breakthrough in research for my PhD thesis was a study of the trade in kola nuts between Ashanti and the House of Cities. And in doing that, I discovered that there were three groups, not Wangara, although Wangarawa, the Hausa term for Wangara is Wangarawa, because it's a house that they put an AWA on the end of words like that for plural. Anyway, the Wangara that were in Katsina and places like that were merchants, just as they were all across West Africa. So they were there and they were important. But the merchants that came to dominate the cola trade with Ashanti were three groups um, of merchants that one of them called themselves Agalawa, a second one called themselves Tokarawa, and the third called themselves Kemper and Berry. And my PhD research was that discovery of these three groups that dominated the trade. And it's interesting because they were obviously into importing cola nuts, which was very profitable. They also ended up, owning quite a few plantations. They ended up breeding donkeys like crazy because
They
it takes
with donkeys?
donkeys to
What
carry
about
cola.
okay, okay.
And why you have to breed them is because where the cola comes from is an area where donkeys don't live because of the tsetse fly. So that you might go to Ashanti to buy cola and take 100 donkeys with them, but maybe 50 of them die. So you're constantly breeding donkeys because it's still worthwhile to you know to breed donkeys and let them die when you get to the other end. Then you figure out how you get back with whatever you bought and to make a profit. So the Agalawa in particular made a lot of profit. They ended up concentrating in Kano, and the wealthiest Nigerian to this day are the descendants of Olaudah and Dantata of Kano. The
Repeat it.
Dantata
What?
family,
Repeat it.
they're, the wealthiest Nigerian is a merchant by the name of Alhassan Dantata. He died in the 1950s,
Okay.
but his children are billionaires,
Okay.
and he started out as a cola trader. He's Agalawa. I know. I've interviewed the family a lot. They even have a museum in Kano in their own house
Okay.
about the family. So, but they also owned a lot of slaves because what are you going to do? At the time you invested, you invested in plantations, you invested in people. So that's what they did. They made a fortune.
Yeah, I was just about to ask you to tell me about the descendants of slave owners, and you just did.
Well, the other ones are the aristocrats who had control of or owned a lot of slaves, and those families are all dominant.
Do they have
They run
titles in Africa?
the they run the Nigerian government.
Do they have titles in Africa?
Hmm?
Aristocrats in Africa, do they have titles?
The aristocrats did. It could be the emir. It could be
Yeah.
a high-ranking official.
I
Oh
remember
yeah,
years ago.
families, families. They pass this on.
Yeah. I
Of
remember
course.
years ago, I read the article, but obviously I don't. Well, I wasn't born then, but years ago, you wrote an article on the Fulbe aristocracy.
Yes.
That was a long time ago in Percy, that
Yeah.
old journal.
Well, I think my jihad book now supersedes all that.
Yes.
I don't know if you know that book. It's Jihad in
I
West
know it, but I
Africa.
haven't read it. But I read the old article on the full be aristocracy.
Well, if you don't get it, I can send a PDF to you.
Of
So
course, that would be good.
just remind me
Yeah, I
because
will. So
I'll
yeah,
probably forget, but
no,
I can.
yeah, yeah. That would be good. So, are you planning to write other books? I know you're writing a book. No, are you going
well,
to write another one?
I just published a biography of a guy by the name of uh, uh, Muhammad Gardo Bakwakwa.
Who was that?
University of North Carolina Press just published it.
Who was he? Who was he?
Well, he was enslaved in what's now northern Benin
Okay.
uh, in about uh, 1844, 1845, and he ended up being taken to Brazil. Uh, but that one of his master in Brazil was pretty stupid, and he worked on this master's ship, but the master took a consignment of Brazilian coffee to New York City in 1847, and Muhammad Gardo Bakwakwa jumped ship.
Oh, I know him. You sent me the article. So you write about him and Gustavus? Oh yeah, I know him.
Yeah, well, I got a
Yeah.
book out now.
Okay. Yeah,
I can
I
send you
know him.
that too, but it's just out.
Okay,
So
well,
I just finished. I
I
just
could
finished that.
I wrote a review of David Eltis's book, his latest book. It was published in a journal at Atlantic Cataclysm.
Oh, I know it's a terrible book.
I think it's a good book.
Oh,
Why
that's
would it
terrible
why do you say so?
because he doesn't know any African history.
You know, I think I gave it a good review. And
Well,
in the book
that's fine, good,
he said
and you
that
got the book.
he said that the external slave trade did not transform the state of slavery in Africa.
Yeah, well, he's wrong.
Yeah, yeah, I
He's
read this book.
wrong. He created the Voyage database.
Yeah, I
It's
know.
nothing but guesswork. It's nothing. You try to find any of the sources. Try. You won't be able to. It's all
Yes.
guess.
Yeah, you were cited in that book. He was responding to an argument proposed by some that the transatlantic slave trade transformed the nature of slavery in Africa, and he said no.
I know he says no. He also said no that the cultivation of rice didn't come from Upper Guinea coast.
The what? The
But
rice. Yes, I read that article on rice. I read it. He
yeah,
wrote,
well, he's
yeah.
wrong.
David Richards was a co-author, I think so. Yeah.
I worked with David Richardson for a long time, but when they published the article on rice and attacked Judith Carney's work, I could not talk to David Richardson again.
Really?
Look, they don't know African history. They don't know Africa. I know. I've taken David Richardson to Calabar.
Mm. I like David Richardson died
They don't know it.
unfortunately.
David Elvis doesn't know. He knows the names of all the ports along the coast. That's all. He thinks you can tell ethnicity by a name.
Well, I read his latest article
It's
published with an
crap.
African writer.
You
It was published
you
in
can't
Slavery and Abolition.
you can't write. You can't tell people. You can tell if somebody's a Muslim often by a name. You can tell somebody who might be a Khan because they have a day name that's an Akan name. Beyond that, you can't tell nothing from name alone. Nothing. And he doesn't even know what ethnicity is because there isn't any such thing. It's not ethnicity. Only what people are talking about is language. They're not talking about ethnicity. No, no, no. David Elvis and I, we don't get together.
You don't get
Once upon a time, we were very close, but he does not read African history and he doesn't understand it. You find where he talks about the political history of Africa, he doesn't know the political history of Africa. He doesn't know. He knows European political history. He knows American political history. Comes to Africa,
Well, for me, for
He
Africa,
doesn't
let me tell
know.
you, for Africa, I
Anyway,
read Akusua Purby. I've read her. I've read McCaskey. I've read Garrett Austin. I'm a fan of Kwame Aryin, who died a long time ago.
a very good friend of mine when he was alive.
Yeah, Kwame
Yeah,
Aryin.
they're both very good historians.
Yeah, Ivor Wilkes. And I try to do a lot of indigenous Africans.
They're good
Like
historians.
E.C. Ejiogu. Do you know him? E.C. Ejiogu. Maybe I'm mispronouncing his name. His name is E.C. Ejiogu or Ejigo. He's from Nigeria. He writes on the
Ikechi,
Arrow. Yeah, E.C.
Felix Ikechi,
No, not Felix. But this is a he writes on Nigerian history and the Arrow.
Afigbo,
Yeah.
Afigbo.
Yeah, I know
Yeah,
Afigbo and
well,
I
he's
know
not
John
a.
Origi. John Origi. Do you know John Origi?
Yes, I I know him. Yes, of course.
Where is he now?
I don't know. I don't know. I know Njoko too very well.
Yeah, I know him, but so bye. We have to end the conversation because of the zoo.
Origi, I don't know where he. I wouldn't be surprised if he's no longer
Who,
alive.
who, who, who Origi?
Origi,
Okay, okay. But I'm saying we have to end because this is the room. But
but
thanks for
I don't
coming on.
know. I don't know him.
Yeah,
The person who would know would be Carolyn Brown in New
yeah.
York.
No, no, I'm saying we have to end because of the Zoom. The Zoom link is running out,
Okay.
unfortunately. So
Well, we'll
bye.
talk again another time.
Yeah, yeah, bye. And I'll interview Henry. All right.
Yeah, do
Yeah.
that.